It's one of the fastest growing religions across the world and is expected to surpass Christianity. Islam, as many are saying and as the figures show, is on the rise. The growth of the Muslim reverts in the UK is also increasing, with many communities from London to Norwich and Manchester seeing a weekly rise in the number of conversions taking place. Today on In the Spotlight, I'll be joined by Khalil Mitchell from Ihsan Mosque, Adib Aiton, who will be joining me on the line. He's a recent revert to Islam, and also in the studio is Aysha Iqbal, an author and a psychotherapist. Welcome, Khalil. Great to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
You've seen recently a rise in the number of conversions to Islam at the Ihsan Mosque. Tell us more about this.
It seems to be the case. I would say it's a general rise in interest in Islam as well, just from myself being on the ground and being in public places and people finding out I'm Muslim and then showing an interest in that. It's a slightly different dynamic. But yeah, there has been more shahadas in the last 3 months. More people are embracing Islam.
And you said that you've been seeing this quite regularly on a weekly basis. More people are coming forth to, become Muslim and convert to Islam than prior.
Well, before Ramadan, there was shahada every week. There was one in Ramadan as well, and there's one quite recently with somebody who fasted Ramadan, prayed with us, did all these things, but was having trouble kind of embracing Islam. But then just after the 27th night, he became Muslim, mashallah.
And those who are coming to the Ihsan Mosque and who are taking their shahada, what do they, when you have conversations with them, if you have those conversations, what do they say is propelling them towards embracing Islam and embracing this religion that has been demonized and vilified for so many years in the media and has such negative connotations associated with it in the mainstream?
A whole range of reasons. It's impossible for me to boil it down to one. I mean, some people, I think generally one thing can be said is that people experience our company. They keep company with us. And we're a community. We're not groups of individuals. And they witness something in that. Then they see the togetherness of people in the mosque, particularly in Ramadan. And I think that is something that cuts against this individualist way of behaving that people seem to be consumed by nowadays. Everyone's solitary existence. It's just not the way things used to be.
Do you think that community and them seeing the togetherness and the community of Muslims when they come together for their Friday prayers or during Ramadan, that is attracting them? Because people are in the West, especially since COVID, there is a lot more isolation as well and a lot more reflection perhaps.
I would say it's just general keeping company. I mean, obviously there's an emphasis on community or just other than groupings of people in Islam. I mean, there's no such thing as social isolation in Islam. All of the 5 pillars, each of them, you can break them down, incorporate groupings of people, not individuals. But I would say it goes, in Norwich particularly, it goes beyond that. It's keeping company in terms of having coffee, hanging out with, speaking, calling people up, making sure they're okay. There's a whole emphasis on community that goes beyond the mosque. And it's quite important to emphasize that.
But it also must go beyond community, right? People embracing a faith which is very different from, which expects a lot of changes in one's lifestyle from that those who are converting are used to.
Absolutely.
There must be something. Are there other reasons that they explain to you as to why they want to come in? Have they read a copy of the Quran? Have they also met with other fellow Muslims? Is it because there's are they disillusioned with life in the West, perhaps?
You're right in saying it's other things. The community aspect is the exterior, it's the outer environment, but the inner thing is what people are, somehow searching with and struggling with and trying to diagnose. There's a fundamental understanding that people who become Muslim, that there is a creator, that everything is given to them. And ostensibly what we're finding is that in this period of social isolation we've been through, still the knock-on effects of which are still present in society, we have people desiring something other than their social engagements, other than their community of employees or workmates or friends in the pub or friends that they've had from school. There's another thing where they're in some ways, asking questions, wanting to know bigger answers. And the questions as to what the meaning behind their existence, I'd say that more people, inshallah, more people have been asking these things.
And that's quite a responsible position for you to be in when you have people coming to you and you're representing Islam to some degree for these new converts to be. How do you even how do you get started in conversation with them? What do you say to them?
It's just friendliness. I'm just a bridge.
Friendliness. Oh, the power of friendliness.
I'm a bridge.
Okay.
Being in the community that I'm in, I don't have to think about very much other than getting them to other people who perhaps have more of an understanding of these things than myself. The weight is less on my shoulders. I just have to bring people to other people. That's my kind of role in the community.
Okay. But it must also be very difficult, I imagine, being raised as a Muslim, living in this country with siblings and cousins and family and friends who are Muslim. I mean, it's a challenge for myself to often balance both cultures. How do you find those who are converting, how do they then come to that kind of a position where they're able to balance their lives in the West with a religion that is, bringing them to a high moral level, which often is in stark contrast with the Western system or the Western so-called values?
We need to look at who the people are, the environment that they're in. And you could say that it's not a formal diagnosis as such, but you need to be aware of where people are coming from, their circumstances. Are they married, single, before they become Muslim? Because these things need to be understood prior to them saying Shahada. You cannot have a decontextualized Shahada, devoid of what Muslims actually live as and interact as and who they actually are. There has to be an understanding of it's not an emphasis on the prohibitions as such, but there's the role of the Muslim in terms of their engagement, how they do things in the world, how they deal with the relationships, how they deal with work, how they deal with businesses. And these kinds of things, to some degree, need to be understood prior. And people are bridged from these different zones.
But these are quite significant, dramatic differences that a new revert needs to then undertake. It's going to make a massive impact in terms of their relationships, as you've mentioned, in terms of their way they operate in business, in terms of in just every area of their lives. They're going to have to make drastic changes. Do you encourage a gradual development into the faith, or as many reverts in the past, do you encourage there's that kind of immediate transformation that you have to make to your life, and you have to start practicing the 5 prayers immediately, you have to stop taking interest, all the things that typically have been done in the past? Or is there a shift in the way people are now being encouraged by the Ihsan Mosque to develop their religiosity in Islam?
Well, you can look at a type of checklist thing where certain things are addressed with people coming into the deen, but it happens organically as opposed to happening in an organized manner. We are people of we're organisms, and that needs to be understood. There's no system. It's not really a system of dawah or the need to tick boxes. People find out these things without anyone really making an effort to tell them. When you come into a grouping of people who are Muslim, they organically find out what they need to be and who they are in the light of these other people. And ostensibly that happens without any effort needing to be really made.
Mm-hmm. But you're obviously a revert yourself. You've been a revert for many years, and you've also analysed yourself the way in which many Muslims who come to the religion, the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
You've mentioned some of these. What do you think are some of the greatest challenges? Because you said that sometimes it can be that they take it to the extreme. Sometimes they find it very difficult to balance the East and Western value systems.
There's lots of different levels of that. You can't overcome individualism by thinking about it on your own, because you're intrinsically within this thing of being on your own. My Shahada in some ways was in 2 parts. It was becoming Muslim and then finding Islam. And I only really found Islam upon moving to Norwich, where there was a community of other people thinking and doing and saying things that were in accordance with this tradition of over 1,000 years. So Islam was something that wasn't really taught to me. It was something that I witnessed. And this is an important thing that needs to be understood. In this age, we've got people saying Shahada online. Now, I'm not making a judgment against people saying Shahada online. I'm not somebody qualified to do that. But it's almost incumbent to find real company and to, not just anyone. The Muslims are the highest teachings and the highest of beings and exemplars of the deen, exemplars of Islam. And that's something that I would say that we do have in Norwich. I haven't encountered it to the same level of intensity elsewhere.
Why is that happening in Norwich, do you think?
Norwich was established over 40 years ago, and by Allah, without any real organization. It encompassed many great men and women of knowledge.
Yeah.
It was founded by a particular person who's somebody who's been a great guide to a great many people, called Sheikh Dr. Abdul Qadir As-Sufi. And he ostensibly, you could say, founded the community and was a means for us to encounter each other. And if it wasn't for his teachings, many of us wouldn't have become Muslim. We certainly wouldn't have found each other in the same way. So that needs to be understood, that aspect of the history. But in its being, in its reality, the way it currently is, it's certainly something special. It's certainly something happening in terms of the vibrancy between people, how they are with each other, overcoming themselves, overcoming being on their own. And it's something that we all struggle with.
And joining us over video link is Adib Aiton, who is a recent revert to Islam. Adib, hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. So you've been a revert to Islam for around 2 years now, is that right?
It's about 2.5 years, yes.
And what is it that's brought about this? What is it that's brought about this change in you? Why have you decided to embrace Islam?
Well, obviously, I was just listening to Khalil there, and I think he hit the nail on the head when he said that there's not one variable that you can kind of whittle it down to, so to speak. I mean, for me, it started off in quite a typical fashion, I guess. I had a few Muslim friends, Palestinians in particular, while I was doing my master's degree, who I was very close with. And after I submitted my thesis, I actually went to Palestine for a few months and spent another 10 months after that in Lebanon. And you can imagine the kind of impact that this had on me. I lived just across the road from a beautiful masjid in Palestine, and I'd wake up every morning to hear the adhan, and I just became interested in it through that. And after that, I've moved back to the UK and started reading Quran. I took quite a gradualist approach, I guess you could say. It wasn't like there was this one lightning bolt moment, so to speak. I just carried on exploring it through lectures, through reading, and then one day I remember just stepping outside on a beautiful sunny Edinburgh afternoon and just looking at the world around me, and it just kind of clicked. It just sort of made sense somehow that Allah was imminent, He was immediate, and that He had been there all along. This thing that was just so obvious, but somehow I had managed to miss it. So I, after that, returned to Norwich, and I didn't actually say my Shahada at the Ihsan Masjid. It was at another masjid in Norwich, and it was about a year after that I started going to the Ihsan. I spent like this year just pretty much on my own, kind of in seclusion and isolation, just reading and building up the foundations of my knowledge.
Right. Okay. For many, new reverts to Islam, it can be a challenge, though. As I was mentioning earlier to Khalil, that the polarity between, the Eastern morality of the Eastern morals and values, and it's obviously Islamic morality, and the kind of Western way of life are very at odds with each other. How do you deal with these two value systems?
Well, I think there's a distinction there between the sort of contemporary Western way of life, talking about that on one hand, and then value systems on the other. I think if we look at a lot of what undergirds Islam, a lot of its core teachings, it seems to me that it's not actually that at odds with a lot of European tradition anyway, but certainly in the modern world, the age of materialism, hyper-individualism, there's a real butting up against Islam there, I think. But as Khalil said, the remedy for that, and I've realized this over the last year even more, after getting involved with the community, is community. It's spending time with people who are more knowledgeable than oneself, which involves a degree of humility, a degree of modesty, admitting that one doesn't know all that one would like to know about this, and learning from them, and allowing them to guide you. But this debate about Islamic values versus Western values, I think it's a little bit, it obfuscates things. It's not actually that dramatic a transition, not from my experience anyway. Before becoming Muslim, I was an atheist, right? So I didn't really believe in a God or God, and that for me was the most difficult thing to grapple with, was understanding what is meant by God. So I think it's, as I say, I think this whole debate about value systems is a little bit overblown.
So how does someone who's an atheist, who doesn't believe in God, how does Islam introduce you to God and then help you embrace God? How does that even happen? I can't imagine personally.
One cannot put one's subjective experiences like that into words, It's just not something, I'm sorry, I wish I could provide you with a better answer on that, but it's just something that very gradually starts to make sense. As I say, the more I looked at the world around me while reading the Quran, it just started to click. It says in the Quran, right, that the veil, it talks about the lifting of a veil. It talks about sort of people wandering around blind, not able to see the truth. And that was how it felt, as if a veil had been lifted. It's the perfect analogy. I couldn't put it any better than that.
Talks a lot about the darkness and the light, and the darkness being the
Indeed.
cover, and the light bringing more revelation, insight, knowledge, and understanding. But you've also experienced others, like, people in your community and other friends and peers who have also been showing an interest in Islam also?
I have, yeah. What I found interesting is, I wouldn't want to put words in other people's mouths and speak too much on other people's behalves, but I mean, they. One thing I've noticed increasingly over the last 6 months or so is that a lot of them have sort of trodden a similar path to me, in that before becoming Muslim, they sort of flirted with other traditions, other belief systems, Buddhism and this kind of thing, but they found it wanting. They found it lacking. That stuff only takes you so far. I mean, I used to practice meditation and all that kind of thing. It's sort of quite hip these days. But there was always this feeling that there was something beyond, something bigger, as Khalil said. And it's the Quran. It's all in the Quran. The more it was just revealed to me through that. I mean, subhanallah.
And how has your life changed since embracing Islam and taking a new, this spiritual route in life, with, influenced obviously by the Quran and Islam itself?
Significantly more illuminated, just looking at the world through different eyes, not getting too bogged down with the everyday debates about, politics, things going on in society, but just this stuff is important. I'm not saying we should be quietist. I'm not saying we should be apolitical, but you're able to unplug from it and tap into something higher, remove oneself from the everyday trials and travails of the dunya, and to experience something much more transcendental, to use an oft-used and overused term. It's uplifting, soul-nourishing. These are the sorts of terms I would use to describe it.
Also joining me in the studio is Aysha Wright, an author and a psychotherapist, and she's written this book, Aysha Wright, Muslim, A Young Woman's Journey. Aysha, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, your journey into Islam is quite fascinating. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Essentially, I had left school It was about a year after I'd left school. I was interrailing with a couple of friends, having a really fantastic time. We'd travelled through various countries in Europe, and we got in touch with an acquaintance of ours who had travelled about 2 months previously to the south of Spain. And we thought we would get in touch with him. He said, yeah, come on down, you can stay with me, you can meet some of my friends here. And he had actually become Muslim. And so we arrived in the city of Granada in the south of Spain. And all of us proceeded to ask him what on earth he had done, what he was doing, how he'd become Muslim, what that meant for him, and what it meant for his everyday life. What did he have to do? What did he have to believe? And it just went from there.
So you'd gone to save him?
We'd gone to save him thinking that he'd done something strange, not really knowing, having heard that he'd become Muslim, we thought he'd joined some strange people.
And what was it about his explanation when he was having dialogue with you and telling you about his experiences that struck a chord with you and made you think, there's something here for me?
First of all, he looked very different to how we had seen him a few months earlier. He'd grown a beard. He was a bit neater than he had been. But he also just had a kind of different composure and a seriousness that I hadn't seen in him before. And we hadn't connected in the same way beforehand. It had been just going out and hanging out, but now it seemed that he had a different kind of focus and a different purpose. And he was living with some other gentlemen who, they were all in their 20s. And they were just really kind of special feeling people. There was an energy that I felt that they had between them, which wanted me to know more about them. So I found myself asking more and more questions about who they were, what their background was, and everything about Islam and what it meant to be Muslim.
And what was it about Islam that, really captured you going forward and, encouraged you to find out more, learn more, and then to embrace it?
I think it was that I was really interested to know about Islam. So what is Islam? What does that mean? But it was when people started talking about Allah and what the reality of Allah is, and the reality that Allah is, full stop, that Allah is the existent and everything has come from Allah and everything will be returned to Allah, how we've come from Allah and how we're going back to Allah. So that connected me to a kind of thread that I'd felt all my life about the presence of Allah always accompanying me and being something that I had experiences of throughout childhood, that little kind of glimmers here and there, and then very strong experiences, which I felt didn't have any answers or a context within how I'd been brought up, but which then began to reveal itself when I was in the company of the Muslims.
And so when you did embrace Islam, how did you go from having those glimmers to that once you'd had come into it, you'd had glimmers and experiences of Allah and God in your life, and now you were embracing a faith which brings Allah into your life on a more significant scale? How did that impact your life? Because you must have been living a regular kind of Western life prior.
I feel like in a way I didn't embrace Islam. It was more that Allah took me on. So I think when I started understanding that it wasn't me who was doing this thing, it was that something was being done to me, where it kind of turned everything upside down and inside out. So I had an experience where I felt really drawn to the Muslims. Everything that they said made sense. I felt like everything I asked, whether it was to do with spirituality or economics or politics, I couldn't really find fault with what they had to say. But that doesn't mean that one becomes Muslim just because you agree with concepts or thoughts or transmissions or ideology. So I remember having left Granada to continue on our travels, and then I felt I had to come back, because I felt like if I didn't come back, I'd be missing something that I would always be curious about. And on the train back, I just had a very profound experience of wondering, like, should I become Muslim? Shouldn't I become Muslim? Should I? Shouldn't I? And then something that all fell away, completely away. And I had a very deep experience of Allah is. And that didn't feel as though it came from me. And if it did came from me, it came from some very deep part of my being. And it was something which was like an indelible imprinting, which I then knew something about reality, which I couldn't turn from. And I knew that if I was to turn from that, then I would be betraying the core of who I am. At the same time, we all have a self, and there was many things in myself which felt that this means I will have to do this. And it wasn't so much the things that the Muslim does, but the sense of identity. So everything that I'd built of my identity, I felt was falling away from me. And part of that I could give into, and a part of it was, no, but I'm an individual. I choose my own way. I'm not going to be like everybody else, very teenage kind of way of being. But then I felt that it was somehow inescapable. It was checkmate. It's like, but Allah is real. Allah is real, and I will do whatever it takes to live in accordance and in harmony with that reality.
You come from a very intuitive space, it sounds like from a very heart-centered space as a psychotherapist. Do you ever feel, as a Muslim born and brought up in this country, I've often felt that there was a disconnect from the heart in the Islam that I was taught when I was growing up. I had to rediscover my faith myself. As somebody who came into Islam and coming to it from that very heart-centered, intuitive, inner space, did you ever feel that the Muslims that you were being introduced to or that you were meeting along the way were perhaps not fulfilling or were not adding to your inner journey? Do you feel there is that gap?
I felt that everybody that I met just was like this fountain of nourishment, which I freely drank from. But it was not just that they spoke about Islam, it was that they spoke about Allah and about the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So it was all the things which relate to the understanding of Tawheed and the understanding of ayats of Quran in context within a certain topic of conversation, but also the way that people spoke about the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam with incredible reverence and honor and respect and love. And somehow when two people do that, or a group of people do that, wanting to know more, something happens in the heart, which is way beyond ideology and concepts, which all have their place. But when it comes to who one feels one is going through life, it's those things of one's essential sense of self and heart, which are the determining factors in one's intention and one's will.
And the Quran itself, I had to study the Quran myself when I was being raised in Islam. We were never taught to understand the religion with any kind of deep significance. So I studied it myself. And for me, the profound moment was when I kept reading about the heart. For me, it was like, wow, the Quran talks about the heart a lot as an organ that thinks and rationalizes and feels. And for me, who has an interest in psychology, I found that pretty fascinating. Are there aspects of the Quran that really strike a chord with you?
Well, when you speak about the heart, I think of that ayat, which is only by the dhikr of Allah, only by the remembrance of Allah can the hearts be tranquil. And so that doesn't mean that when we remember Allah, we automatically maybe feel tranquil, but there's a knowledge in one's heart that it's true. So even in times of great trial or difficulty or complete devastation or grief or loss, knowing that Allah is real and Allah knows what we do and what we think and how we feel it's not as though I want to say it's a solace, but it's the knowledge of that and the recognition of that, I think, adds to the experience of what the unfolding of one's destiny is.
And we spoke earlier about, obviously there's an increase in conversions. Islam is one of the fastest growing religions. You've noticed an increase in interest from those around you too. Tell us about this.
All I can say is that it's wonderful and really exciting. I don't know why it doesn't happen more often either. As somebody who became Muslim and wanted to shout it from the mountaintops, it's just very special to witness. And I feel like it makes sense. I think we are in a time where people are having crises of meaning in their life. As adolescents, we push the boundaries to discover who we are and to search for the meaning of who we are as individuals. But there's a turn of the spiral where we have another crises of meaning about, okay, well, I've built all this for myself, I've built this identity, I've built this thing that is who is me. And then as we go older, I've built my job, I've built my family, I've got my house. But then at some point, there's a question which just comes up, sometimes unprovoked and uncalled and unasked for, which is like, well, what's the meaning of this? Where am I going? And that's not to say that one wants to have the greatest of families and jobs and whatever it is, but that if it's only for oneself, then one's cutting oneself off from the meaning of who one truly can be.
And you sound very excited about there being a change in the air. And what have you been experiencing and witnessing around you in regards to people demonstrating an increased interest in Islam and an increase in people converting?
I've seen people become Muslim and then coming into my house and having lunch with lots of other people and seeing their kind of joy and excitement and interest and curiosity, which I think when one has come to the Deen, it evokes all of those things which one felt oneself. So it's always a renewal for oneself when people come to the Deen. And then it just feels like such an honour to be able to help support or encourage or help or just be alongside people when that happens.
Now, you obviously reverted 30 years ago. For those, for those who have an interest in Islam and are contemplating, perhaps coming into the faith, what would you advise them? Because it can be a challenge. There's a lot to learn and embrace. What would you say to people from your own experience? What's the best way to come into this?
I'd say Allah is real. Never lose heart. Seek out the best of company. Seek out the best of company. Seek out the best of company.
You just emphasised that 3 times. Seek out the best of company seems to have been something that's very important and significant in your journey then.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you need people who can teach you, who can almost decode really what is happening in your own society, in your own traditions, in your own context, and help make sense of it for you, because Islam isn't a culture, as we know, it's a filter for culture. So for me, becoming Muslim with Spanish Muslims was interesting because they were very Spanish. They dressed Spanish. Their makeup was Spanish. Their body language, the way they expressed themselves was Spanish. The literature they loved was Spanish. The transliteration of Quran was a Spanish transliteration. So I learned a lot about what it is then to be English and to keep the best of one's own culture, but be Muslim within that. And then I feel that because in our community there's so many different races and cultures, we can appreciate all of those differences, but also it highlights what the Deen actually is, because we all are adhering to that one thing and yet enjoying the culture the different cultures that we share, rather than taking on a cultural practices. Yeah.
And Khalil, so, we've obviously just spoken to Aysha, and she's obviously also mentioned, like yourself, there is an increase in conversions. Islam obviously is one of the fastest growing religions in the world today. But for many Muslims for many new Muslims, it can be a major transition. And sometimes in Norwich, we know it's fantastic, but in other parts of the UK, it can be quite challenging to get the right community, to get the right guidance, to get the right advice, and to know what direction to take. Have you got any suggestions along those lines? Anything that mosques can do, anything that Muslim leaders can do, anything that the community and society can do to make things easier if this is going to be a growing trend?
Many mosques are, to some extent, unaware of the amount of people that have said Shahada online, for example, particularly in the last 3 years. I would say there's an entire program needed for people who say Shahada, whenever they've said Shahada, to really compound their understanding of the Deen. And ostensibly what I found myself, and what many people who say Shahada away from community, away from places like Norwich, is that people simply haven't learned the Deen. They have certain ideas about what they have to do and what not to do, but it's not compounded. The biggest problem I found, certainly, it wasn't explained to me in the right way, was the different madahib Hanafi, Shafi, Hanbali, and Maliki.
Yeah.
How they work, and it certainly wasn't explained to me. Everyone came to me and said, follow the strongest evidences. Now, to somebody who's just become Muslim, who has no idea of the Arabic language, hasn't read very much about it, you end up compiling a series of things that are usually the hardest options. Because logically, the biggest steps that somebody makes from, in terms of their lifestyle, from moving from non-Islam into Islam, is to give up a lot of things. So you kind of take on this thing of thinking it's all about giving up things. So whatever the options are within these different evidences that come up, you take the option of removing them, which might even be your culture. So it's typical for many people to become Muslim to think that they have to dress in Arabian clothes and make that move away from being who they actually are. So in terms of advice that's needed for people who are within Muslim communities or groupings of Muslims in different masajid throughout the UK, people who become Muslim need company. They should really be welcomed into houses and fed and just need to find kind of like companions, as it were. Often what happens is people learn about Norwich and kind of bundle them off to Norwich. So, this kind of thing happens, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
You welcome them.
Yeah, we I think if anyone's watching this who's become Muslim recently, who lives in the UK, they should certainly think about visiting us. I would say that. And as to what they can find in their localities, some people are ignored, some people aren't, some people think it's about changing their culture, some people don't. They just, there's a lot of things that need to be addressed after Shahada.
And you mentioned it would be good for leadership within the Muslim community to perhaps introduce a program for reverts, or to take some responsibility for the fact that people who do come into this faith can find it quite overwhelming. And, it needs to perhaps be made more manageable for them, or more, something that they can adopt with greater ease. Any suggestions of how this could even begin?
Well, again, the problem is kind of structuralizing these processes. It should happen organically. If it's not there, to some degree, it needs to be initiated. So mosque committees, whoever is taking the role of being the leader of the mosque that people are attending, they do need to have a kind of like a need, as an urgency for them to look at those who have said Shahada within a certain time period, particularly in the last few years, and to address their needs and to ask them, do you need anything? How are you getting on? More often than not, they will say everything's fine, but they might not be even making wudu correctly. So it's through this endeavor of actually spending time with the person, checking up certain things are being done correctly, even cleaning themselves. The things that people who have been Muslim for a long time are simply unaware of is that the idea of istinja and cleaning yourself after going to the bathroom is completely alien to a lot of people who come into Islam. Mm-hmm. And they kind of hear that they should do it, but they don't do it because it's really odd to a lot of people. Sure. These things need to be discovered. These things need to, you need to actually sit down and kind of like have a social session to find out what it's actually, what are they doing? Have you got this? Are you doing this correctly? Are you doing that correctly? Where have you learned about this? So this needs to happen. This needs to happen urgently. But anyone who's become Muslim in the last few years who haven't found coherent groupings of Muslims, i.e. Muslims who have given them the time of day, follow one kind of teaching of the deen, not multiple. And certainly from a point of view of the madhabs, you need to find people who follow a teaching and understand what the different madhabs are. There's certain books that I would recommend. One by Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley, on the madhabs of Islam. Do you remember the name, Aisha? What's it called? The madhabs of Islam? Yeah, the four madhabs. Yeah, that's essential. Okay, so I would say that the Muslim communities should get copies of this book and then disseminate them to people who've become Muslim. That might seem a bit abstract, but undoubtedly they're going to find, people who've become Muslim are going to find the different schools. They're going to wonder why some people pray like this, some people pray like that, some people pray like this. And that most of the time, the congregants of the mosque are not able to explain these things correctly. That has to be understood. People coming into Islam do not have these differences of opinion explained in a coherent manner. So copies of this book in particular, as the most valid book in terms of explaining what these different schools are about, these things need to be purchased and given to recent people who've become Muslim. I mean, that's the least that can be done. And they need to be told to kind of like disregard a lot of the other books that they've got, but weaning out what's relevant and what's not relevant, that's a whole different subject as well. Typically people become Muslim and they're handed a lot of books. And you know, they instantly get this book collection that they kind of like work through in an arbitrary way without understanding certain books are more important than others. Obviously, they understand the English translation of the Quran, but even the judgments of that are not sometimes easy to understand. I think, you know, that it needs to be taught in some ways.
And where do you see going forward? How do you see your journey into Islam developing and evolving over the coming years? Do you have...
From now on?
Yeah, going forward, what's your... Do you have any plans to do more for Islam, to work with more reverts, to write more books, to speak more?
Absolutely. I've always felt since I've become Muslim that the kind of the pleasure of life is in the company of the people who are Muslim and the things that we do. And it's not just having a spiritual path, but it's about establishing things that feel right in one's community and in society, being able to be part of something where you feel certain aspects of Islam which maybe have been forgotten or made or almost forgotten, but because of this focusing on small things instead of big things. But to be part of those big things, a part of a pleasure of life, they're the things that I think teenagers actually are really looking for. It's like real purpose.
Yes.
And being able to establish things and relating to social justice and fairness, which is not about rebelling, but being a part of something which is deeply real.
Yeah. And Khalil, how could you add to that in the terms of your journey going forward? What do you see yourself doing? You're a man of great insight, whether it's about, you know, but not just about Islam, but the political landscape, the social landscape. So much knowledge. Are you going to be putting it to use in different ways for...
I have no idea. I mean, Allahu Alam, Allah knows. I mean, for the time being, I'm in Norwich. It's a very sane community that's expanding, and many great people are moving to Norwich now. We've been privy to this as well. It's not just people becoming Muslim. It's people who have, as I say, found Islam elsewhere that have ended up there.
Sounds like Norwich is could be a good template in that respect.
Well, in many cases it is. One thing I would add is that we kind of have to get out of this duality of reverts, born Muslim.
Yes.
Or you know, revert's a worst word. It sounds like reverse. You know, or other words.
Yeah.
Or convert sounds like convict.
Well, what's the word we should be using?
Well, new Muslim is what we use.
New Muslim.
But as
I like that. I often,
But for somebody like myself who's been Muslim for 20 years, it might not be apt.
But the people who came to the deen around the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, they were all people who became Muslim, but we never refer to any of the Sahabas as being converts or reverts. They were the Sahaba. I prefer Muslim.
Just Muslim.
I mean, it's Aysha Iqbal made this point, you know, publicly. We've got to get this thing knocked off. Okay. Plus, with places like Norwich, it's very important for generational Muslims to know that this is open to them as well.
Sure.
Okay, so one thing that's very important to understand is not a cultural thing. It's more to do with the fact of modernism and postmodernism, if you want to put it like that. They're not the right terminologies. A type of modernist mentality has taken over the world in the last 50 years. It's affected Muslims as well as non-Muslim nations. As what Adib was saying, it cannot be underestimated, is that there's been a shift from a traditional way of doing things in Europe and a traditional thing of doing things in Muslim countries into this strange era. So really what we're saying is that there's a great many Muslims who are born Muslim who need to find their footing in the deen. And I would say people who are born Muslim or people who have said Shahada should at least come and visit Norwich to see what we've done. Because as I say, many people who are turning up there are people who have become Muslim, but many who have been born Muslim, who've kind of like need to step out of this cultural Islam that they're within and find their own footing on their own 2 feet, other than what their parents have given them.
And embrace the essence of Islam.
Yeah, it's not a denial of what their parents have given them or the type of Islam that their parents have given them. This is increasingly what we find. It's like there's a parental Islam. It's almost like, I can't break that. I can't learn new things about the deen. This has to be kind of like put aside. You know, Sheikh Abdul Qadir said that one of the greatest cultural occurrences in Britain are the Pakistanis and the Urdu language. And he laid a great emphasis on this. He said there's a rich culture there that predates Pakistan. It's important to the Mughal reality. It's like a thing that's in people's beings. Now we, as people who've become Muslim, to some extent need to learn from that as well.
Oh, I guess we can all be learning from each other.
Absolutely.
The East from the West and the West from the East. Khalil, it's been an absolute pleasure having you in the studio. Aysha writes, thank you so much. It's been amazing speaking with you. And thank you to Adib also, who's been joining us on Video Link.